The first one is, what was your first idea when you learned you were the curator of the Biennale?
You mean my first idea for the show or my first feeling?
No, your first emotion.
My first emotion.
Oh,
I was completely shocked, and I always say, when Paolo Baratta called me, there is this legend now that he calls people up like this out of the blue, and I don't even know, I was at the office at the Highland, and he just called me, and he says, "I'm President Paolo Baratta," and of course I knew him, and I thought I knew what he was calling me for. So it was very exciting and very humbling at the same time. So,
and finally, well, not finally, because we are beginning, but what is your aim about organizing such a show?
I ask myself that every day. I think, there are several goals. I think my first goal is to be able to bring artworks and artists and make them shine and make them have an amazing platform through which they can say or they can express what they want. So in a way, the show, my first sort of client in this exhibition is the artists. And so thinking that I want them to be proud of what they do. Of course, it is probably the most important exhibition they will be part of, but not mine, meaning in general the Venice Biennale, but I also want them to be able to have a great experience and really bring their best artwork ever.
So your priority is about the artists?
I think so. I think I want
more than the show itself.
Well, the show is made through the artists. If you don't have the artists, the show I can't do a show without them. So, but then of course I think the other priority is an experience that the audience is not just the art audience can appreciate and can relate to. So I try not to create an exhibition that is not approachable or that is not that is too, it's too obscure. So I think that's something that I've learned quite a bit from my job at the Highline, where I really talk to a very broad audience and certainly not just the art world. So I try, of course, the Venice Biennale it's a much more specific exhibition, but it is an exhibition that is visited by hundreds of thousands of kids and schools and the general public. So for me, it's important to allow them to have the tools to enter in relationship with this exhibition in general and these artworks in particular. So I try not to do a show that talked only to the art world, but that open up and touched upon larger issues and larger questions that one might call existential questions that we're facing now.
And you said that you began the project with the beginning of the crisis, the lockdown. So what has radically changed from your point of view about the artists for the last years?
I think what has changed is, from a practical level, of course, all of a sudden, especially in the first few months, everything was completely stopped. People that had major exhibitions got postponed, galleries were closed, the market didn't work anymore. So, the big art machine, which is made of all these different elements, as soon as one stops, everything else freezes. And so that was, I think for many artists was kind of for me, it was kind of paralyzing. It was you start having much more time to think about what we're all doing in this universe and in this world. So I think what changed was a forced pause that was imposed on the artists and make them and us kind of reflect on the system and on the art world in general, and maybe open up a space for more, intimate or intimistic reflection on, the role of art and the role of artists in this time.
No, in terms of production, did you observe a change in the production of the artists?
Well, I think there are of course practical changes that we're still witnessing now. It's so hard to find basic stuff like steel, and everything costs so much more. So in a way, I don't want to generalize because artists have very different languages, but that's why I'm saying that I noticed that artists are going back to also a more intimate or intimistic medium. Like I've seen a lot of more discrete objects, so like drawings or paintings, more diaristic practices rather than the wow big sculptures that we would say. There is still, the people that made the wow sculptures can still afford to make the wow sculptures, but I think there is maybe a more generative process about looking inwards and just create also art that is more like a reflection of the time that we live in.
And is the zeitgeist important for this show?
I think it's important because people will eventually remember it as the COVID biennial, because that's clearly it is happening in COVID time, and this COVID thing is not going away. So it's even though the show is not about that at all, but so in a way, I think thinking about the zeitgeist is I always go back to the artist. I think when you will see the show, I ask myself, can a visitor see that there is a slightly different approach to art making than there was maybe 3 years ago? I don't want to make great statements because we have to see lots of these works I have not seen, but I do think there is a slight, you as a visitor, I hope that you will see this shift also in the art making. Of course, we are in the midst of it, so it's hard to judge and make big statements, but I think it will be there in the air, but maybe a more subtle than just big declarations and proclaims.
Okay. And in the conference, you said that most of the artists you have chosen were through Zoom. What is the danger of a selection through Zoom?
Well, the danger is that I have not seen many of the artworks in person. So you never know that they might turn out to be, very different from what you've seen. But kidding aside, I think the good part was, as I said in the conference, that I was able to have very nice and earnest conversations with the artists in a way like two of us are talking from your apartment, from my apartment. We would never be in such kind of intimate relation normally if we were in a press conference, or so that I think was very generative. I think the risk is that like what I miss the most is being able to smell the oil of the painting and being physically present with a sculpture and being able to walk around it. I think there might be surprises, but we'll find out very soon, just in 10 weeks. So that, I think that's the short answer. The risk is a few surprises in the exhibition.
And also there's a difference between an image of the work and the work itself.
Yeah, no, totally. So, I mean, we try to kind of look at the works in person with the video, not just as a JPEG, but yes, it's not the same thing at all. So, I think in a way it's a question of trust, and I've trust the artists, and I also want to allow them to experiment. And if something turns out slightly different than what we were expecting, but this difference is making the artists happier, I think I as a curator I want to support it. Of course, if they send a painting that was supposed to be 1 by 1 and ends up being 5 meters by 3, and then I don't have the space to put it, that's another story.
But you are definitely a 21st century Biennale, huh?
I think the show has this double side. There is, of course, a lot of very, very young production and quite refreshing. So many artists that have never shown before. And then there is the historical artworks exhibited in this sort of 5 small exhibitions. And this is to me something that has been very important in the way I made this show. And it's I think of the past as a way of reading the contemporary art and the sort of contemporary present. So in a way, I knew from the beginning I did not want to do a show that was only a snapshot of what's cool and trendy right now, because of the crazy time we live in. And in a way, the time that I was allowed to have more compared to other curators also allowed me to sort of zoom out and look at the history of the Venice Biennale, and not just as a succession of one show, so that you just compare with the previous show, but kind of zoom out and look at, for instance, those exhibitions that happen in times that are kind of parallel to the ones that we're living in. For instance, I always mention the 1948 Biennale, which was the first edition after 2 years of two editions that was interrupted because of the Second World War. So many people refer to it as the sort of the rebirth biennial, because on one side, it introduces many new tendencies and movements. It opened up to American art, but on the other side, it really turned backwards and looked at all those languages that have been censored for different reasons, because of the fascism and because of the 20 years of oppression, but doing this sort of exercise of looking forward while never forgetting what just came before. And this process of, it's an exercise, not interrogating history and not assuming that what happened 100 years ago is stable and fixed, but that those are stories, histories and stories of inclusion, but also exclusion. And so
there's fashion in art, we know that, right? And one of the fashion now is about women. So how to avoid, what is the danger about? Because most of your artists are women. So how do you avoid fashion with taking women in the same time?
I never thought women were fashion. I think I have a different vision here. I think it's very tricky to say it's fashion or fashionable. It's unfortunately a very sad reality that most of the exhibitions in the world don't feature amazing women artists. And I think there is a history there in the Venice Biennale, but in the rest of the world as well. I'm lucky that I live in a country that is a bit more advanced on gender equality. Also, maybe just symbolic in exhibition and museums and institutions, but I think it's part of the way I've always curated shows. And so I don't think about, I'm sure people will say that, but what can I do? I always made the joke that, without naming names, but not even 15 years ago, when a curator did a show in Venice that had 20% of women, nobody would ever dare to say, is it a male biennial or masculine biennial, right? Why is it the problem when there are lots of women and not lots of men? So,
but can we say there's something different when we deal with women artists?
I think it's a good question. I do not want to label 213 artists under one umbrella. It's impossible. And I think it's the beauty of the Venice Biennale is that you can say and tell so many different stories that are intertwined. So I don't want to risk, again, saying, oh, women artists are more focused on this kind of material. I think it was true, but it's the double face of the kind of cliche of, because there is something handmade or sewn, it's a woman artist. So I think in the show, and what the show tries also to do is to show a chorality or plurality of voices. And many artists in the show that probably would totally reject the idea of being labeled as, woman artists against the men. So
no, of course, but there's a statement about choosing women artists, no?
But there is, it's a statement because we wanted to make a statement, but also it could very well not be a statement because it's never been a statement for 125 years that it was a male show. So I think, I would love also for viewers to go there and just look at the show as a show without interrogating gender or how these artists
No, but come on,
identify.
I'm a journalist and I observe the lead, so I'm asking questions.
Sure. I mean, of course, it's a statement, but it's a statement, you know, there are different reasons. It's a statement because the theme of the show looks at the ideas of the post-human thoughts and philosophy, and that very much is the core, the conceptual and the philosophical core of the exhibition. So, said in very quick words, the idea that we're living in a world that we have passed the centrality of man as the center of the universe. And of course, when we say man, we generally mean the individuals, us, but also, you know, the idea of the white Western male at the center of the world to leave space for different creatures. They can be female, they could be non-binary, they can be hybrid, like the ones that, you know, like Harrington imagined. So I think that's one of the main reasons why, you know, the percentage or the number of women artists is so high. But I think it's also important to remember that this show happens in Italy, in a very historical institutions that have never really, besides few exceptions like this show that I mentioned called Materializzazione del Linguaggio, given the right space, or like it's simply not a reflection of the world that we live in. You know, if you do a show that has 20% of women artists, I don't think it's that famous snapshot of what's happening in the world.
And